Well, it's a Thursday. That means, of course, we have to be joined by Wyoming Liberty Group for their most recent update. Steve Klein joining us from Cheyenne, Wyoming, with Wyoming Liberty Group, looking particularly dapper today. There, Steve. Good to have you on the program. And I have a theory about how I can avoid what we're talking about today. See if you can agree with my theory. If I am constantly broke when I drive down the highway and I drive the just cruddiest possible car, then police officers will pull me over and give me stuff rather than pull me over and get me in trouble. How do you think that's working out for me so far?
You know, Glenn, I'm willing to bet that hasn't quite happened, gone your way yet, but, maybe you keep trying. I don't know.
I'm sticking with the theory, Steve. I'm sticking with the theory. Well, this brings up what Steve is, I used to drive the I-10 corridor on a regular basis, and you know why I bring that up. Could you tell everybody what I'm talking about?
Well, certain highways, and not just I-10, but across the country, a lot of controversy, especially in the last few years, as various media reports and have started to bring to light the abuse of civil forfeiture laws in various states and under federal law as well. What civil forfeiture basically is usually drug laws, but they also exist in other areas. Here in Wyoming, it's only a drug law, the Controlled Substances Act. Gives police the power to seize your property under the suspicion of that you might use it or are intending to use it in a drug crime. Here in Wyoming, in particular, it's usually, let's say they find actual drugs in your car. Then they're going to seize cash along with it and just about any other property you have, and then arrest you for drug trafficking because it is a crime. And the war on drugs is a really important debate, but that's really kind of a tangential thing to this. At least usually they're actually finding drugs. But the power under the law doesn't just say, oh, when you find drugs, you can seize other property along with that. The law says anything that they think is intended for the drug trade, they can seize, and then you have to go to court to get your property back.
So in other words, if I was pulled over, and let's say there was a little baggie of something in my car, then obviously I was transporting that to sell it, and therefore they could go ahead and seize my car.
Yeah, theoretically. And again, I'm in writing this new study. This is a new study, a paper I just published yesterday with the Wyoming Liberty Group, and you can download it at wyliberty, wyliberty.org. It's the latest Liberty brief. This basically discusses what the law allows here in Wyoming and does show that there have been some instances of abuse where usually it's large sums of cash that are found, and they basically, the Wyoming Highway Patrol put out a press release kind of gleefully saying, hey, we found $130,000 in this guy's car, and he couldn't tell us why he had that money, so we kept the money. They didn't charge him with any crime because it's not illegal under Wyoming law to have a lot of cash on you, and then let the guy go on his way.
So the reason I bring up, for those who don't know, the I-10 corridor is that's become a dangerous place. Police officers will invent, and I've watched many a video, YouTube is filled with them right now, invent a reason for pulling someone over, and if they can find large sums of cash, they seize the cash from you, and good luck getting that cash back. To them, it's been a way to bring money into the department. It has very little to do with drug trafficking, though their excuse down there is, well, obviously, if you're on that highway with a lot of money, you're trafficking drugs because there is a lot of drug trafficking on that highway. So are you worried about that slippery slope in the state of Wyoming?
Yeah, Glenn, I am. And I don't think we should wait until, again, crossing the line legally, having even just one example here. I'm not an investigative reporter, so I didn't go in depth to see whether the law is, to what extent it's really being abused here. I suspect it's not being abused. I'm not here to just to go after law enforcement here. The fact is the law allows it to happen, and to have even one instance of this, and even then, you look at a situation, a guy driving on the highway has $130,000 in cash in the back of his car. Of course that looks suspicious, but again, that's not a crime. It shouldn't be a crime to carry a lot of cash on you. When it gets really bad, small towns in Texas, they shook down couples who had a few cell phones or who had other property, and they threaten them with we'll either arrest you for a crime or you can sign over your property and be on your way. So waiting for scandal, I think, is a very bad approach. And in the paper, I lay out some of the worst instances. And I guess building on what you just said, it's not just that they're taking the property, then you have to go to court to get it back. And because it's a civil proceeding, you're not charged with a crime. First of all, there's no reason beyond a reasonable doubt standard. There is a preponderance of the evidence standard, which means the government only has to prove by, let's say, 50% plus one that your property was used in the drug trafficking. But it's already, the burden is on you then to go get your own attorney, which you then have to pay out of your own pocket because, again, you're not in criminal court, so the government doesn't have to provide you with an attorney. So the odds are really stacked against you. So even if you do end up getting your money back or your property back, then you're out potentially thousands of dollars to an attorney to go and get this stuff back. Now, I tell you, Glenn, I am an attorney, but I think that's ridiculous.
Well, one of the cases you're talking about, I'm trying to remember if it was Dallas or Houston or which city it was, but I remember watching and reading on this story because several local news organizations covered it in Texas. A family was literally found a car they wanted to buy from a car dealership, so they drove into the city with cash on hand to buy the car from this used car dealership. Pulled over for some minor infraction by a police officer, and he found the $6,000 they had and seized the $6,000. Now, if this family is going to buy a used car for $6,000, they probably don't have the money to hire an attorney to fight to get that $6,000 back. In fact, it'll probably cost them that much money to get the money back. I mean, you're an attorney. Am I off base on that?
No, Glenn, you're absolutely right. And that's where the real tragedy here comes with this kind of enforcement. When you have, let's say, $10,000. And there's been other cases right here in Wyoming where people have tried to represent themselves in court. And imagine yourself going to court without a lawyer. And again, we can tell all the lawyer jokes we want. Many of them are warranted. But to try and navigate the court system by yourself, you usually end up in a really bad situation. You don't know how to present evidence. You don't know how the procedure works, and you end up getting pretty much railroaded. So trying to do it yourself isn't really a good option either. And then that final irony, as you said, let's say the money really is drug money. Let's say it's $150,000. Well, there it is. That's just a drop in the bucket for the drug traffickers. That's just the cost of doing business. But if you see, say, $15,000 of legitimate money from an average citizen, yeah, it's gone. You have just taken it from them, and they have realistically no way of getting it back. What's especially insidious is this is allowed under federal law as well, and there's been some very well-publicized cases now that the IRS has been taking money from small businesses for allegedly violating the tax code. For example, anytime you make a deposit of $10,000 into your bank account, you're supposed to report that to the IRS. So if they see a business depositing, $9,000 here, $8,000 there, they start to think, you're just doing this to circumvent the reporting requirement. And then what ends up happening is they just decide to seize all the money until they can go to court. Now, you can imagine being a business like a grocery store in Detroit or a gas station anywhere, and you are operating a cash business. And suddenly, you have all your money taken out of your account. Can you function as a business until you have a chance to go to court? Usually not.
Yeah, I used to manage a rather good-sized retail store. And boy, to go to the bank at night with $6,000 to $8,000 every single night in cash was not an unusual thing at all. But let me ask you though: is there a minimum for this? And I'm just going to stick for a moment with the money you would have in your car. There's other things besides money that could potentially be a problem. Well, let's just focus for a minute on the money you have in your car. So let's say I'm driving down to Cheyenne to see you guys, and I have, let's say, $300 in my car. Would that be enough to make them suspicious? I mean, do they have a limit on this? I mean, do I have to have $2,000, $3,000? What's the limit?
Under the law, there's no minimum threshold. Again, I suspect realistically, it's usually in at least the low thousands of dollars from the cases we've seen. And again, I mean, we have the lowest level of proof when you go to court. And even though, first of all, the police seize the money, and then it's up to the Wyoming Attorney General to go to court to forfeit the money. That's when it's guaranteed to not be your property anymore. That's forfeiture. So they still have that, even that minimal level of proof, though, does affect the way that the police operate. And what's especially weird is we have this very low standard of proof, but even then, here in Wyoming, up to, in a given year, up to 50% of the amount of property proceeds, the value, is actually refunded after court hearings. So on one hand, it's really encouraging that there is a way for people to get their money back or their property back, and they are getting it back. On the other hand, it really makes it look like the police are kind of playing, rolling the dice and saying, well, maybe they won't show up and challenge it, or, well, it's a close case, so let's just seize it and see what happens. Again, putting people through that, either the time, the money, the stress of just having to go and prove, hey, this property is legitimate and it's mine and I want it back.
I'm talking with Steve Klein of Wyoming Liberty Group. So the next question for me then, okay, let's say I had $5,000 on me. They seized it. I went to court. I fought. I got the $5,000 back. Hey, am I also given back my attorney's fee and the hotel costs and whatever else it might have cost me to get that money back?
No.
No.
And that is, and it
cost me $5,000 to get the $5,000 back.
All too often, that's the case. And again, I don't want to emphasize. In this study, my emphasis is that the law is opening the door for abuse that has happened nationwide. So
well, let's be clear about that. You are seeing these abuses across the country, and so since the possibility is here in Wyoming, what you're doing is warning the state about it. Would I be correct in that?
Yes. And especially because we can change the law without affecting actual effective drug enforcement. If we were to raise the standard of proof in court to the second highest level, it's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's called clear and convincing evidence. If we were to raise that standard just to that high, then let's say the police find drugs and find cash along with it, or they find drugs and guns along with it, or they find lots of drugs in a car and they want to seize the car as well. That's then a perfectly legitimate use. Again, we can have another talk another time about the legitimacy of the drug war and things like that, but this is in itself at least assures that you are actually busting a drug dealer. And then, on top of that, you're going to charge the suspect with a crime, and he's going to be brought to criminal court. So well, that's another...
I just want to throw out, since we've been focusing on money and drugs, right away I can imagine some people in Wyoming would turn and say, well, would this be a backdoor way to seize my guns? Or any other property? What would throw up a red flag for a police officer besides money and drugs?
It's usually the money. Guns, of course, theoretically can. Again, this law is very, very broad. It's one law, the Wyoming Controlled Substances Act. It's been on the books since 1971. If you're interested, Wyoming Statutes 35-7-1049, and it's very short and sweet, but it's very, very broad. It goes all the way, into where's the best example? You have this long list in the law of things that they can seize, and they all have this caveat. For example, all raw materials, products, and equipment of any kind which are used or intended for use in manufacturing, compounding, processing, delivering, importing, or exporting any controlled substances in violation of this act. So again, this intended for use. So theoretically, you can be seizing a guy with a lot of guns in his car. You could say, well, I think you're a drug dealer. I think that you are driving somewhere to go and engage in the drug trade, and you're bringing these guns for protection. Again, I don't think I've ever heard of a case like that, but the law is broad enough to allow it.
Why open the door? Okay, take a closer look at that list, because we're going to get into a little bit more next, plus some other cases I've heard from other states that I think go right along with this. I'm talking to Steve Klein from Wyoming Liberty Group. More about this in just a moment. And back in we dive with Steve Klein from Wyoming Liberty Group as we take a look at the possibility that something could come to Wyoming that has been a problem in other states. And one of the stories I was thinking about, Steve, as we were talking in that last segment, there was a gentleman. Now, this is his claim. I wasn't there. I didn't see it. But a gentleman was pulled over in Nevada, and the police officer noticed that in the trunk of the car was a false trunk that he had installed. Now, this gentleman is claiming, hey, sometimes I go shopping. I like to put stuff underneath this. I one time bought a car that came with a false trunk like that just for that reason, so you could hide packages underneath. That way no one breaks into your car and steals your stuff. Well, for the police officer, what this means to him is obviously that's a hidden compartment so you can deal drugs, and his car was seized on the spot.
And again, that's it's very novel. I had never heard of that before, but I mean, again, let's turn it to, if this is under Wyoming law, that would probably raise probable cause to seize the car. Mm-hmm. It's interesting because in some states, I believe Ohio and California, they've now passed wholly separate laws outlawing hidden compartments like that. The more advanced ones, hidden under the seat or fake radio front and things, right, glove compartment and things like that. So again, it's very possible for police to be very creative. And again, it's the temptation has largely arisen from the whole. One of the other big problems with these laws is that the money goes right to law enforcement. Under Wyoming law, the Attorney General seizes the money, and the AG's office has an agreement that they split the money 70%, 30%. So 70% goes to the Division of Criminal Investigation here in Cheyenne, and they are a part of the Attorney General's office, and then the other 30% goes to the law enforcement agency that helped seize the money. So there's really no oversight whatsoever. It's really kind of a legislative gift to the executive branch, because they get to not only raise their own funds this way, and then they get to keep the money and use it any way they see fit.
Now, to be fair about this, you're, again, not saying that this has happened in the state of Wyoming, but across other states, that money can get very tempting. And some states have found ways to collect money from people by highway stops like this. This is why I mentioned the I-10 corridor, to fund their agencies. So the worry here is there might be a temptation in the state of Wyoming. So how do we proceed in shutting this down before it happens?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think the biggest reform is to make sure that in court that there is a raise the level of proof. Again, that will not necessarily help the seizure process, but I think when the police are put on notice that it's that there's a much higher standard of proof, that will pretty much guarantee that they're not going to seize property unless they've also found drugs along with it, or other drug paraphernalia, something like that. We have a lot of other, I think, eliminating this prospective element, this idea that, oh, here's your car with a hidden compartment, for example, you're intending to use this to transport drugs. So get rid of that. I mean, again, you find it with drugs, you find any other indication that it was used, or you have other evidence, surveillance or something, that this car was used in a drug transaction, then more power to you. But especially the other really dangerous thing is that our neighboring state, Nebraska, they actually, through a judicial opinion years ago, the state, I believe their state Supreme Court, pretty much overturned their state civil forfeiture provision. They said this is unconstitutional, you can't do it this way. So what did the police do? They started participating in the federal equitable sharing program, which has all the same problems as the worst state laws. And this is another form of silver plattering, where the police agency gets to use the civil or the federal assets, like the federal attorney general, who has tons of a much bigger budget than your local prosecutor does, and those resources, and then they go and take the money, they keep their cut, and then they send money back, which under federal law, again, is required to be used by that police agency. They can't give it back to the state or anything like that. So that's another thing, that if we're going to reform Wyoming law at all, we should also severely restrict our participation in federal equitable sharing, because in Nebraska, now it's about $3 million a year that they're getting back from the feds for playing ball with them.
Yeah, and again, that's very tempting. Got about 2 minutes left here. I know this may not be your ballpark as an attorney, but okay, I get pulled over by a police officer. What are my rights as far as them looking into my car?
The trouble with that, Glenn, is search and seizure is a very complex area of the law. I don't give general advice about that because, again, if they, especially in a probable cause hearing, sometimes police lie about smelling marijuana or something like that. But it's when it becomes your word against theirs in court, things can get pretty dicey. So as a general rule, a lot of the remedies we have under our Constitution are done after, with evidentiary hearings and stuff like that. So I'm a little hesitant to get into that. But the last point I really want to make is, at the very least, we don't know the whole story of civil forfeiture in Wyoming because there hasn't been enough oversight. Under the law, the AG is required to submit reports to the Joint Appropriations Committee. As far as I've been able to understand, they've never even compiled these reports. So we really need to get things together and start seeing exactly how this is being used statewide.
Okay. Steve Klein, Wyoming Liberty Group. We're out of time here, Steve, but your article will be on my website and your website, which is
wyliberty.org.
And we'll see if we can get it in the Campbell County Observer, too, because this is a pretty interesting story. Good to see you again, Steve.
Thanks a lot, Glenn.